In 1936, down in the slums of Washington, there was this dude named Joe who was getting all set to head off to college. Joe didn't have a whole lot of cash and was living solo in a beat-up car, but he was determined to make things work by hustling odd jobs to fund his college dreams. Joe got in trouble on campus for not paying his tuition on time that day. If he didn't pay up by next week, he would be kicked out of campus. Joe and his pal tried to find a job on the campus bulletin board so they could make some cash, but they couldn't find anything. The day after, Joe was at the library when this really cute girl from his class, Joyce, came up to him and asked if he still recognized her. Turns out, Joyce was Joe's friend from elementary school. They were catching up and having a good chat about the good old days when Joe's buddy showed up and Joyce took off. That's when Joe's friend broke the news that he found a way to cover their tuition by joining the campus rowing team. That afternoon, when they went to sign up, they found out there were a bunch of other students trying to do the same thing. And then 3 rowing coaches showed up. Coach Al told them that they were going to test their fitness, and only 8 of them would make the junior rowing team. Once everyone got changed, the physical test kicked off. They had to do push-ups, sit-ups, running, rowing, and even some wacky stuff like sewing big logs. It lasted for days, and a lot of them were totally wiped out by the end. After busting their butts in training for days, the coaches finally revealed who made the cut. Turns out Joe and his buddy made the list. That night, the 8 new rowers all hung out and got to know each other. While everyone else was chatting, Joe snuck off to Joyce's dorm room to ask her to come join him for a boat ride. Joe revealed to Joyce that he made it onto the rowing team, and now that he was an athlete, he got all these perks, like having to eat 3 times a day, a free dorm room, and no tuition until he graduated. When Joyce found out, she was stoked. The next day, the junior rowing team got back to training, and that evening after practice, when Joe was leaving, he wandered into the boat-making room. While he was checking out the boat, the guy who made them, an old dude named George, showed up. He told Joe he could come by any time. Joe was stoked. As a thank you, he helped George tidy up. For months, Joe had been loving his new life. He studied in the morning with Joyce, practiced to the rowing team in the afternoon, and helped George make a boat at night. One day at the campus office, the officials asked Coach Al about the race next week. Coach Al said he was going to send the junior team first because the senior team needed to rest for a bigger race, the rowing competition between universities in New York in 2 months. If the senior team won in New York, they could represent America in the Olympics in Berlin, Germany. That night, Coach Al and his buddy Coach Tom were trying to figure out a rowing plan for the junior team, which wasn't very well trained. The team was in good shape physically, but their rowing technique was still pretty terrible. George, who was also there, gave Coach Al and Coach Tom some advice. He said that the most important thing wasn't the team's technique, but having a strong leader. Instead of stressing out about changing strategies, it was better to find a captain who could take charge. George's words gave Coach Al a sudden idea. The next day, Coach Al gave Bobby, the senior team's captain, a call. Knowing Bobby's laid-back but determined personality, Coach Al was confident that he would make a great captain for the junior team. The next day, Bobby took charge of the junior team's practice. During practice, if anyone made a little mistake, Bobby would make them start over right away. The practice didn't end until everyone got it right together. The night after, while George and Joe were painting a boat together, Joe opened up about his past. He showed how his stepmother mistreated him after his mom died and his dad remarried. Joe couldn't handle it, so at 15, he ran away and lived in a car all alone. George was really concerned after hearing all this. For days, the junior team kept practicing until race day. At the big race, Joe's junior team from the University of Washington would be up against the rival team from the University of California, who had won for the past 2 years. Before the race, Bobby cheered them on. He wanted them to show off all their hard work in front of everybody. Once everything was set, the race began. Washington got off to a rocky start and California took off really fast. But Bobby was able to rally the team and bring everyone together, and little by little, Washington was able to close the gap with California. Just 200 meters before the finish line, Washington was able to pass California and ended up winning the race by a boat length. It's been a month and the junior team was still practicing like always. The other night, Coach Al, Coach Tom, and George got together to talk about the inter-university rowing competition. Coach Tom was impressed with how well the junior team did last month and thought maybe they should represent a campus in the competition. But Coach Al shut it down because he had already promised the campus board that the senior team would go. Coach Tom wasn't happy that Coach Al made the call without discussing it with the team first. When Coach Tom left, George mentioned how he was impressed by Coach Al's enthusiasm back when he was on the rowing team at Washington. But after college and the team breaking up, Coach Al seemed to lose that spark. Now, after years, George was happy to see that same enthusiasm in the junior players. He suggested to Coach Al that he should really consider who deserved to represent the campus in the next race. The next morning, Coach Al told everyone that the junior team would be representing the campus in the rowing competition in New York. Everyone was totally surprised. After the announcement, the campus board got mad and asked Coach Al why he broke the agreement. They were really upset about the decision because the race was super important for the University of Washington's reputation, especially since they hadn't won it in 20 years. They believed the senior team was more prepared and were really unhappy about sending the junior team, who they thought weren't as good. Coach Al said he had the final say, which made the campus board even angrier. They even threatened to fire him if Washington lost the race. In the afternoon, Joe and Joyce were out on a date at a restaurant when he spotted his dad nearby. When he went to talk to him, Joe found out that his dad knew where he lived all along and knew everything about him. Joe asked why his dad never visited, and his dad said he believed in Joe and that he was old enough to make his own choices. His dad told him he could come home anytime, but if he wanted to live on his own, his dad wouldn't force him to come home. Joe felt let down by his dad's seemingly indifferent attitude. A week later in New York, while preparing for the big race, Joe was making a lot of mistakes during practice because he had a lot on his mind. After practice one afternoon, Coach Al yelled at Joe for not being focused lately, even though they had an important match the next day. When Joe didn't seem to care, Coach Al got mad and told him to go back to Washington and kicked him from the team. That night, while Joe was packing, George came over and asked him to join him. At the workshop, George mentioned that he had been building boats for years and knew which ones were good. He explained to Joe that the best boats aren't necessarily made from expensive wood. It's all about how the boat performs on the water and how passionate the rowers are. George emphasized that no matter what, everyone on the boat must have enthusiasm, because that's the key to success. Joe was totally hit by George's words. The next morning, before the race, Joe caught up with Coach Al and poured his heart out about all his problems and life story. He begged Coach Al for another shot, really wanting to stay on the team. Joe promised to give it his all to help the junior team win. Coach Al was moved by Joe's sincerity and decided to give him another chance. The race was finally underway. This race would decide if Washington could go to Berlin or not. Washington started off a bit slow in last place. Bobby told the team to work together and give it their all. Washington picked up the pace as they put in all their effort to row as fast as they could. Their muscles were sore, but they didn't let up. They just kept rowing and finally made it to the front of the pack. After fighting for it, Washington clinched the top spot. Their dedication and hard work really paid off. Coach Al was beaming with pride in the stands. After 20 years of constant losing, his team finally snagged the win. Thanks to this epic victory, the Washington junior team officially secured their spot as the U.S.'s representatives in the upcoming Olympics in Berlin, Germany. That night, while everyone was partying about the win, a messenger from the government showed up with some bad news. Because of the economic crisis, the government couldn't pay for the rowing team to go to Germany for the Olympics. Coach Al was told that if they still wanted to go, they had to come up with $5,000 for registration, and they only had 1 week left to do it. Coach Al was completely shocked by this news. The next day, Coach Al and the rowing team talked with campus boards to figure out how to get the team to Berlin. They realized they only had half the money they needed. That's when Coach Al came up with an idea. The next day, Coach Al hopped on the radio and spilled the beans about his team's struggles and reached out to the American folks for help. After the broadcast, loads of people pitched in and donated. Turns out Joe's pops was one of the donors. Even though he seemed uninterested, he always had his son's back on the down low. After trying really hard for days to gather money, the night before the team was supposed to leave for the Olympics, Coach Al and his colleagues tallied up all the donations. Unfortunately, they were still short $300. Just when everyone was feeling hopeless, The coach from the California team showed up and handed over a check for $300. Coach Cho got all emotional and teary-eyed. He never expected the rival coach to come through and help his team out. As the California coach was leaving, he told Coach Al to keep his head up and do their best for their country in front of the whole world. The next day, the Washington team flew into Berlin, Germany. At the Olympics opening ceremony, they bumped into the speediest U.S. runner, J.C. Owen. As fellow reps for their countries, they cheered each other on. With a grin, Owen said he wasn't just representing the country, he was going to show the world that black folks were way more than meets the eye. The next day, the Olympic rowing race kicked off. The USA team didn't hold back and ended up taking the win. Sadly, one of the rowers collapsed after the race. After the doctor checked him out, Coach Al filled the team in on their buddy being sick and needing to take it easy. Sadly, the final race was coming up in 3 days, and his condition was only getting worse. Since there were no backup players, Coach Al had to ask him to tough it out and keep competing. Coach Al told his team to row their hearts out before they started. He had faith in them and knew they could make it to the finish line. As the rowers were getting ready, Adolf Hitler was also spotted watching. A few minutes later, the Olympic rowing final race began. It was clear that the USA team was struggling, with one member not in their best shape, but they didn't give up. Bobby, who noticed the rowers losing steam, tried to lift their spirits, reminding them of all the hard work it took to get to this point. Slowly but surely, the team's morale improved and they started to gain momentum. They began to pass the teams ahead of them. Italy, Germany, and the USA were all super close as they came to the finish line. It was impossible to tell who won just by watching, so the judges had to look at a photo taken right when they crossed the line to decide. When they printed the photo and examined it, the judges announced that the U.S. team had won. All the Americans listening to the radio, including Joe's dad and Joyce, were cheering like crazy. Coach Al and Coach Tom looked really proud from a distance. Coach Cho said the guys were the best rowing team he had ever seen.